Hi, all. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Dr. Lindsey Hoffman Chappell. I am a key account manager with Envu for the Western region. For those of you that do not know who Envu is, we are an environmental company that was purchased from Bayer about 2 years ago, and we are now a standalone global company that offers solutions for turf and ornamental management, range and pasture, as well as pest management and public health. Today, I'm here to speak to you about how we can, as turfgrass managers, maximize turfgrass health to minimize weed pressure, but then also reduce management inputs, which include things like irrigation, herbicides in particular, if we're talking about weeds, but also callbacks. So that's employee time as well as money spent on those callbacks. So, really, what we're going to do today is look holistically at turf grass management and how it ties into turf grass health in general. So, you see here, there are a number of different topics that we'll look at. And really, the goal is to understand how we can manage our properties, whether they're home lawns, commercial properties, to promote turf grass health and utilize things that we call best management practices, which are really just cultural practices that we're doing on a daily basis that is going to improve the overall health of the turf grass plant. And we'll talk about some best management practices and how we can really tweak those to optimize them to promote turf grass health. And then ultimately, with a healthy turf grass stand, we are going to reduce weed encroachment, weed pressure, and that ultimately is going to lead us into a conversation about herbicide management and how we can reduce the need for some of those herbicides and other inputs that may occur when our turf grass health is not at its optimal level. So, all in all, again, we're going to take a look at turf grass health, how we can promote it as turf grass managers using best management practices, how those best management practices are then going to reduce weed pressure and encroachment, and how that's going to tie into the use of herbicides, utilizing fewer, hopefully long term, reduce the amount of money spent, reduce callbacks, and ultimately have happy customers at the end of the day. So let's start by looking at turf grass health and what that means. So when we look at turf grass health or a healthy lawn, there are definitely things that we can identify as to what that means or what that looks like, I should say, right? So when we say a high quality lawn, it's healthy, meaning there are fewer weeds, versus a low quality lawn, which is unhealthy typically and has more weeds. So in this picture, you can see this is an example. We would identify this turf grass property as being unhealthy, right? So you have thin areas, there are bare spots, you have clumpy grasses here and there. But overall, what this says to me is that this low quality lawn doesn't have the resources that it needs to be able to grow and be at its optimal level. And so, with that, it's opening up to weed encroachment and making that turf grass susceptible in general to pest and pest pressure. And so, again, we talk about quality as healthy, right? High quality, healthy versus low quality and unhealthy. And really, what we're doing when we're looking at these lawns is we're using visual cues, right? So, it's an aesthetic value that we're placing on this based on visual assessment of the lawn. And so, the difference between a healthy and unhealthy lawn, that's easily recognizable. So, example on the left hand side, that's a Bermuda grass lawn. You can see that it's very attractive. There's a lot of characteristics that we can talk about within the next couple of slides that we can identify when we compare the picture on the left, so the Bermuda grass lawn, to something on the right, where you can see that there's weed encroachment, there are thin bare spots that are going to open up potentially for additional weeds to come in. And that's really what we're working towards, is to managing our turf grass to look like the picture on the left. And this is just another example now looking at a cool season grass on the left in comparison to something on the right. So again, there are visual qualities that when we look at properties, we can identify as this looks healthy, this is a nice property, the nice lawn, versus this is not looking so good with the bare areas and the weeds. And so in a turfgrass research capacity, if we're getting down into how we evaluate things as scientists, we can evaluate or put a number on turf quality. And a lot of times we do in order to rate things. And so I've pulled out three of the characteristics that are utilized to judge turf grass quality. and how we would put a number to those. And the scale that we use from a research standpoint is 1 to 9, where 1 being not great, probably the worst quality, and 9 being the utmost perfect quality of a turf grass stand that is ever possible. And so the 3 characteristics that I've pulled out for talking about quality is density. So if we reference the picture in this slide, the more dense a turf grass stand is, generally speaking, will have fewer weeds. And a lot of that has to do with outcompeting the weeds for resources such as water, fertility, or sunlight that y'all might be managing from an irrigation fertility standpoint. And then the turf itself is going to cause that soil surface to be shaded. So you're going to have the out competition of a dense turf grass stand out competing the weeds. Now we're focusing on weeds, but a dense turf grass stand is also indicative of something that's healthy, high quality. So it's going to have better able to outcompete pests in general. So we can talk about weeds, but in addition to insect pressure or as well as disease pressure. So again, density, more dense, the more turf grass there is, the fewer the weeds you will have. And so looking at the picture on the left, I would say this would probably be, from far back, probably a 7 or an 8, right? For density, if we're looking at quality, right? So that's a very dense turf grass surface. One of the other characteristics that's utilized is uniformity. So again, tying that to weed encroachment, the number of weeds that are there, the less weeds that are in a turf grass stand, the more uniform in general you're going to have of that property, that piece of turf grass itself. So again, fewer weeds is going to be, you're going to be tied to more dense, and then the less weeds you have, the more uniform a surface is. And so you can see that this photo here is pretty well uniform. Again, within that high range of 7 to 8, if we were to rate this for turf grass quality. And then the last characteristic that we use is color. So again, a healthy green color. So usually for cool season grasses, it's going to be a darker green. Warm season grasses, we're probably in that, dark green to mid green, right? But as soon as we start to see yellowing of a turf grass, that could be indicative of a number of different things, right? So nutrient deficiencies, drought stress, maybe there is a disease that's causing problems. But again, we can use color to provide a visual assessment of what's going on with the turf grass stand. So again, all of these qualities are influenced by how well we maintain that turf grass stand in general. And so what we really need to look at is what are those best management practices that we can employ so that we can get a healthy lawn, a high quality lawn, and not have to consistently come back and manage for weed encroachment in particular. So when we look at, as I just mentioned, best management practices or overall what influences turf grass health and quality, it's really how we manage that turf grass is really what's in our control. So if we look at what we can employ from a best management practice, or you'll see me abbreviate this as BMPs, one of the first things is turfgrass cultivar and species selection. Now, a lot of you may not have the opportunity to select the cultivar or species. You're maintaining already established properties. So this might be something that you'll just have to deal with and figure out what species and cultivar you're managing and then optimize your management practices for that. Now, in situations where you have the opportunity to renovate, that's going to be key to make sure that you're putting the right plant in the right place. And we'll talk about a few resources that are available if that's an opportunity for you to renovate. Other factors that we have influence over are growing conditions, cultural management practices, and then obviously chemical applications that can help the turf achieve its highest quality and be the healthiest turf grass stand possible. Now, all in all, when we marry those best management practices together, we're going to put the turf grass in a better place to be able to withstand things like weather events, right? So a turf grass will have better ability to withstand drought for longer periods of time if it's being managed at optimal levels. It's also going to be, as I mentioned, better able to withstand pest pressure, things like fungal infection or insect pressure. So even though we do not have the ability to control weather or pest pressure, we do have the ability to tweak our best management practices, utilize herbicides or pesticides in general as part of those programs to really get a high quality, healthy turf grass stand, which ultimately is going to save y'all money and potentially increase revenue by having customers see your lawns that you're maintaining, see how beautiful they are, and then come to you with as a customer that way. So let's look now first at some of these best management practices that we may be able to add or tweak or think about a little bit differently to increase plant health and turf grass quality. All right, so as I mentioned before, we want to put the right plant in the right place. Now, again, this might not always be possible if you're maintaining a property that's already established, but we want to have an idea of what these turf grasses mean, especially from a management standpoint. Now, this is the most recent hardiness zone map, right? And so we start to see some of these areas change with regards to getting warmer, even more north, and getting colder in periods of time. And when we talk about turf grasses in general, we like to draw definitive lines, right? So we have these hard lines across where cool season grasses are can thrive, where warm season grasses thrive, and then we have that transition zone. One of the things that we're starting to see is that grasses are adapting and able to survive outside of these kind of strict barriers that we've always talked about. So, for example, my aunt's house was outside of Boston in Massachusetts, and she had zoysia grass, a warm season grass, in her lawn. The zoysia grass looked great in the summer. It was green while everything else was dead. The winter, it turned off brown, but it didn't die. So again, there are situations where you're going to start seeing that movement of warm season, potential movement of warm season grasses into cool areas. And then we do have sometimes cool season grasses in hotter areas like in Texas, we do see tall fescue sometimes. So it's knowing what plant you're managing and identifying that in these guidelines that we look at, right? So we know kind of the threshold that we're talking about. We have guidelines of what these grasses or think about how these grasses are surviving, but we know that those lines are starting to be blurred. Okay, so we're going to keep in mind these preferred growing temperatures when we talk about best management practices and how we're going to employ those throughout the year to optimize plant health. Speaking about renovation or picking grasses, there are a number of different resources out there. So this is a guideline on what species we're talking about, but for cultivar selection, there are a number of different resources online that are available for selection. If you have the opportunity to renovate properties, you can reach out to me. My contact information is at the end of this presentation, and we can talk about that. But I just wanted to bring this up again because when we talk about best management practices, we'll talk about timing as it relates to both cool season and warm season grasses. So, okay, so we've talked about right plant in the right place. I'm assuming a lot of y'all are managing pre-established properties. So then what can we do in those properties to impact growth, turf grass health, and quality? Now, for some of y'all, you might be working for companies that only do chemical applications versus doing some of the maintenance as well, like mowing or aerification, verticutting. Now, even though that might be the case, it's important for y'all to have an idea as to what those cultural practices are. Not that you already don't, but to have those conversations so that the company doing the maintenance and you, if you're only doing chemical applications, are on the same page because it will impact your business and the health and overall turf quality and what that property looks like. So we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And one of the things we really need to do is optimize the growing conditions, right? So we'll revisit some of this information later on in the presentation, but you can see in the right picture on the left-hand side, a compacted clay soil, what that property looks like. The turf is thin, you're going to have more weeds, it's not going to grow as well, versus on the right-hand side with topsoil that's been top dressed frequently on that property. You can see, again, we can look at the density, which is better on the right-hand side of that lawn. You can see the uniformity. There's no weeds. It's, that dense canopy. And then we also see that the color is great, right? So those three characteristics we talked about, you can see the difference it can make with growing conditions. And so what do we do, or how do we do this, right? So again, with cultural practices that we're going to employ and use for improving turf grass quality, improving health, we want to time it for cool season grasses during optimal growth, right? So that's in the spring and the fall. The reason why we need to do this and back off in the summer is because, again, that's their optimal growth period. So during that period of time, they are going to be able to recover quickly, and you're not going to predispose those plants to more injury. Let's say if you were going to do some, I don't know, aggressive practice during the summer, that cool season grass is already growing slower. It's not going to recover as quickly. And so again, you might open that turf grass canopy up for weed encroachment in particular if you're doing something during the summer versus the spring and fall. Now, the opposite is for warm season grasses, right? So most of our cultural practices, aggressive cultural practices, are going to be done during the summer when those grasses are growing at their highest level and are able to recover quickly from any type of damage or injury, including mowing, right? So mowing is an injury, it's a necessary practice, but they're able to recover quickly, put up shoot material and put up root material. So one, we're going timing, which all of y'all I'm sure know. The other consideration that we need to think about with when we're conducting cultural practices is that we're conducting it on a healthy turf grass stand. And that healthy, I'm using a little bit loosely. So the left-hand side, definitely we want to make sure that when there's drought, you've got drought stress turf, we're staying off of that turf. One, because any type of traffic could cause secondary damage to that turf, right? So we can see that there was traffic on that, whether there was mowing under drought stress, but those brown senesced areas are not going to recover. Conversely, if we look at the picture on the right, we see that this mowing was done after a rainfall, or let's say more than likely a rainfall versus a heavy irrigation event. But you can see it looks like there was a zero turn mower that went around the well of that tree. It was too wet and it rutted up the area. So that's going to take time and money to recover. But now again, those areas are open up for weed encroachment, and then subsequent herbicide management is going to be necessary to make sure that you don't have weeds coming in and that turf grass is able to reestablish. So we're not mowing or adding fertility, applying herbicides in particular on drought stressed turf. All of those things have the potential to cause more damage than actually do good and promote health and quality. Another consideration that we need to think about, and again, in addition to conducting cultural practices on healthy turf, is mowing and mowing height. And again, we want to make sure that at all times possible, we're mowing at the highest height possible in general. And this is going to be generally between 2 and 3 inches for home lawns, whether it's cool season or warm season grasses. So you can see in this picture when there's a mower pass that went through and it was too short, you can see that turf grass canopy is thin, there's weeds in there, but you can see in comparison at a higher height of cut, that turf grass stand is more dense, there's less weeds, it's a little bit more uniform, and it actually is a little bit darker in color. So we want to make sure that, maybe 2 inches when the grass is growing at its optimal level, spring and fall for cool season, in the summer for warm season, raise that height up during stressful periods, and especially moving from fall into winter, because there's a direct relationship between mowing height or shoot height, right? So the amount of leaf tissue that the plant has to the depth of rooting. So if we start at the bottom, the lower the height of cut, the shorter the roots are going to be. So depth and density is going to be lower in that lower mowed turf grass. And what we really want to do is encourage rooting so that turf grass plant can anchor into the soil, but also access all of the water and nutrients that are deep in the soil profile. So we want to make sure that we're monitoring that and adjusting those heights as necessary based on time of year, health of the turf grass, and any potential stress that that turf grass could be under. Okay, so we've got plant in the right place. We're only going to do cultural practices on healthy turf. We're monitoring our mowing so that we can adjust the height and increase rooting and shoot growth. Another consideration is obviously irrigation. Now, in my experience in working with, I live in Texas, so working with lawn care companies here in Texas and communicating with homeowners that have their own irrigation systems. They operate their own irrigation systems. To me, this is the most challenging topic of all. I can't tell you the number of properties that I've visited with folks that think a little irrigation is good, so a lot of irrigation must be great. Now, we're going to talk about drought stress first. So this is a picture of an example where sod was laid down, the irrigation wasn't planned or put on enough. You can see that the sod squares did not establish. All of that turf is senesced, but you definitely have a nice weed garden here, right? So all in those sod seams, you can see that those weeds, which are really good at growing in just about any condition, right? So it's dry, it's wet, not a lot of sunlight, those weeds are going to pop through. So we want to irrigate to prevent drought stress, and this can be challenging, especially in areas that go under water restrictions in the summer. At that point in time, the call has to be made whether you irrigate at all or you just let that turf grass go dormant. Don't do any cultural practices, and as temperatures start to warm, customers are able to irrigate again, get back to irrigating so that you don't have drought stress going into whatever season it may be, whether it's fall and winter or summer. As I mentioned before, irrigating to prevent drought, generally not something that I see as an issue when I visit home properties. It's more over irrigation. So I had mentioned before, homeowners think if a little is good, a lot is even better. And you can see this is an example of what happens. In this photo, you can see it looks like this is a low-lying area. So over irrigating is not good for the turf grass, right? So it's going to predispose it to not only thinning, so the density is going to decrease. You're going to open up to potential fungal infections if you're over irrigating. And then in areas where that water may pool, you're going to see there's no turf grass. You could have algae or moss accumulate in those areas, and then ultimately you're going to have weed encroachment, right? So for this point, this cultural practice, the biggest thing is communicating with homeowners and pulling in on resources to make them understand that proper irrigation is going to be crucial to getting a healthy, nice turf grass stand that doesn't have weeds and not additional problems that y'all have to come back for callbacks on. And so what we really like to talk about is deep and infrequent irrigation to promote root growths, right? So in combination with proper mowing height, if we're irrigating deeply and infrequently, that's going to promote root growth even more. So those roots are going to dive deep into the soil profile versus if a little bit of irrigation is being applied every day and you're only irrigating maybe the top 2 or 3 inches. So those roots are not going to be encouraged to grow down into the soil profile with that way of irrigation. Okay, so deep and infrequent, higher mowing heights, you're going to have a great root system, healthy turf grass plant, and the ability of it to really maintain its quality and fight off weed encroachment in general. Now, one thing that we talk about with deep and infrequent irrigation, or the way that we're going to be able to do that, is if the soil is able to hold or accept that amount of water when we're irrigating that deeply, right? So if we have, if you remember back to one of the pictures, a compacted soil, right? So that's clay, maybe it was compacted. Here in Texas, we have a lot of homeowners associations that the construction company will just take an inch of topsoil off. That area gets compacted. They put a little bit of topsoil back on before putting sod. So you're not going to be able to deeply irrigate that property unless we start looking at doing aerification, right? So really pulling a core, taking that material out, opening up those channels in the soil so that water can move through, so it can infiltrate and then percolate down into the soil profile. And that's also going to allow for more nutrients into the soil as well as oxygen to be in the soil profile to encourage root growth overall. And then once we encourage root growth, those nutrients are then, going to be in the plant available for shoot growth so that you have that nice turnover leaf material and a high quality turf grass. And again, the key thing is that when we're conducting an aerification event, we want to time it so that for cool season grasses, you're either doing it in the spring and the fall when they're growing optimally, or in the summer for warm season grasses. Another thing to consider, which you can see here is this example of a thatch layer, is minimizing thatch. Now, this is more of a concern for warm season grasses, but if you have high turnover of clippings, which we'll talk about in the next slide, we want to make sure that we're removing some of that thatch so that we don't have an excessive level. Excessive thatch is going to hold moisture. It's going to hold nutrients that may not be available to the roots. It might make root growth more challenging for roots to get through, and it's not really going to encourage that deep rooting that we're trying to get to. So removing thatch is going to be crucial. Part of that is done with aerification, but you can also just dethatch with a piece of machinery and get to that 1/2 inch or less. So again, this practice is going to be conducted during peak seasons when the turf grass is growing so that we can really optimize and get that turf grass at a high quality level. Lastly, what we want to talk about, I think this is the last where we talked about best management practices, is fertilization. So again, even if you're only making chemical applications and maybe not fertilizing, maybe that's another company that's doing this on a property, the conversation has to be had for optimal levels of turf grasses. We don't want to over fertilize. On the picture of the left, where you can see you have clipping accumulation. This could lead to scalping, so cutting off too much turf grass at once when you're mowing. And we don't want those clippings to sit on the turf grass. You can kind of see here in areas where there's clippings, there's a lighter yellow color that's going to block the sunlight from the plant for it to be able to photosynthesize and produce its own food. So we want to clear those clippings off, but really optimize the level of fertility so we don't have this situation after every mowing event. Now, the picture on the right is a different extreme where fertility was put down on a turf grass that was already stressed. It was put down at too high of a level. There was a miscalculation. So you can see this is actually fertilizer burn, where in some cases you'll see some regrowth of that, but that's going to be slow. So in the meantime, while that grass is trying to fill in those bare areas, you have the potential for weeds to encroach there, cause more problems, and then have it necessary to do some post-emergence weed control. The opposite is also true when we talk about fertility. We don't want to have a weakened turf grass plant. We want to make sure that it has optimal levels of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And those are all things that you can have tested from a soil. You can have tissue tested. But again, it's kind of a lot of times I know folks do it by feel. So being and managing a property year over year, you know what that property needs. But testing may help in kind of dialing in those numbers. So this is an example of a zoysia grass lawn where it wasn't getting enough fertility. So it turned yellow and then that tissue started to senesce. And so to get that back, that's going to take energy from the plant. And then again, you might have the potential for weeds to encroach in those areas that are thin and brown while it's recovering. So holistically, right? So we've talked about a lot of topics with best management practices that y'all, I'm sure, already familiar with, but the goal is to really establish these practices, get them defined so that we're managing at an optimal level so that pesticides are only part of the program and not the entire program. So I put this picture in of a home lawn because, again, someone would not come in and just apply herbicides to this and think that that's going to get this lawn to where it needs to be to get it to a quality of 8, 9, or 10, right? So really what we've got going on, it looks like some areas were over irrigated, some under irrigated, probably some fertility issues. So really it's establishing a program to get turf grass stands, whether it's home lawns, commercial properties, even when we talk about golf courses, establishing a plan to get that plant the healthiest it can be so that we then integrate pesticides as part of the plan and not solely rely on them for getting the turf grass where it needs to be or fixing problems in the long run. And so when we have that healthy turf grass stand, we're really going to reduce weed pressure and weed encroachment. So again, this is talking specifically about turf grass establishment and some things that we can do, but the concepts are the same, right? Right plant, right place, right time of year for cultural practices. In an establishment setting, you can irrigate to encourage weed germination before you plant, to kind of get some of those weeds out of the way. Utilization of pre and post emergence herbicides will be necessary as part of the program. And then overall, just maintaining not mowing too soon in a newly established turf, irrigating properly, and managing fertility as necessary to get that turf established and able to withstand stresses, whether they're environmental stresses or pest pressure. Now, after establishment, there are a number of different resources that you can consult and utilize to help time applications. And these are general recommendations, right? So this is from the University of Kentucky for cool season grasses. But again, y'all have a schedule that's pretty timed out because of the number of properties that you have to manage and the time of year. And these are great guidelines to utilize for how and when we're going to do certain practices such as fertilization or pre-emergence herbicide applications. And the same exists from my company, Envu, for warm season grasses. So we don't have any developed for cool season lawns, but this is an example of a warm season one where we're providing solutions for timing of application. And in particular, if we look at the weeds section, you can see the applications are timed for right around when we see germination of specific types of weeds, right? So timing is crucial, and then also selection of products, which we'll talk about in the next section. So we have these resources. If you'd like some of this information, I can email it to people. You feel free to contact me. Some of your distribution reps, I'm sure, have some of this information. So this is great just as a reference for timing and products. We also have some cool season herbicides that are available. So this is a good reference table that I can make available to people. And also, this is another example. This is specific for Envu products, but looking at what's available for products in warm season turf and in cool season turf. And there's always, I say always, but there's potential for new products to become available. So it's always important to keep that in mind when looking at what you can integrate as part of a herbicide management program. And that's what we'll talk about next, right? So we've talked a lot about cultural practices and how we can increase turf grass quality and health. But again, as I've said over and over again, pesticides are going to be a necessary part of the program. And in particular, herbicides, pre, and post emergence herbicides will help get to a high quality lawn. But in general, we really want to manage to decrease weed infestation, the reliance on herbicides, the need for callbacks, and then the dollars spent. And we do all of that with our BMPs. But now let's look at how herbicides can be part of that program. Okay. And again, what we want to focus on is maximizing herbicide efficacy. So this is an example. And so this was a test facility at a university that they were looking at tenacity. And this is on crabgrass and nutsedge. But there may be cases where you have to come in and do repeat applications, make a broad application if you're trying to recover a site that may not have been managed properly or managed at all for a while. So how do we best make those herbicides kill the weeds that we're targeting, and what can we do to increase efficacy in general, right? So some of the reasons why we can look at this as how do pesticides fail or how are we going to increase efficacy? And some of the reasons what we can look at is incorrect identification of the weed species, which is then going to lead to selecting the wrong herbicide. Another issue you might have is improper timing, right? So applying too early, too late. And I know that one gets complicated, especially from a lawn care standpoint, because you have a schedule to keep, you have X number of properties that you need to hit. So you have a finite window that you can make those applications, but just knowing that in some cases that timing might be off, and we could talk about coming back with some post-emergence opportunities or options to control those weeds. And then there's some other things. So improper pesticide rate can be one thing with an application issue if something was miscalculated. There's some mixing considerations if you're spraying liquid herbicides. And then we can also have lack of uniform coverage. And we'll talk a little bit about this. And I will touch on herbicide resistance. Hasn't been too big of an issue in lawn care yet. We hear cases of it popping up here and there in comparison to what we see on golf courses in particular. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so incorrect identification. A lot of times this is not going to be an issue for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of the weeds, if you're managing the same property over and over again, you're going to recognize. It's going to be the same culprit. So for example, if it's POA, you're going to recognize that in a cool season lawn, maybe by its color, it's maybe a little bit more yellow than the turf grass you're managing. And a warm season lawn, as things start to go dormant during the shoulder season, you'll be able to see that because a cool season, that POA is going to be green, right? So that's going to be an easy one. Hopefully the property you're managing doesn't look like this picture on the left. But other examples, smooth crabgrass and goosegrass. So those are kind of easy ones to identify and select herbicides for. Now, another reason why this isn't as much of a problem in certain cases is that a lot of herbicides, especially liquid formulations, are formulated with more than one active ingredient in the product. So if you're using a herbicide that has, let's say, 2 or 3 active ingredients, you might get coverage of grassy weeds, broadleaf weeds, nut sedge. There are some combinations of those. So you're getting some broad coverage. So that's one thing to consider when selecting a herbicide, is not just picking one that targets for grassy weeds, but really trying to select one that controls for a number of different options. Now, there are certain circumstances, and I've had this year actually a couple of times, where I've gotten pictures of weeds. What is this? I've never seen it before. So those do pop up. The key thing is to be able to identify it correctly so that then you can make the proper herbicide application, and maybe you only have to make that herbicide application once or twice if a repeat is necessary, instead of, identifying it incorrectly, and then we're not using the right herbicide. That's going to, again, cost more dollars, more time to come in and to have to treat that area. So how do we identify weeds correctly that we're not sure what they are? One of them is to use resources that are part of your extension system. So this is an example from Texas A&M, but across the country, Penn State has the ability to help with its extension to identify. University of Massachusetts, we talk about in the central US, a number of turfgrass programs that have extension, or even weed scientists that would be able to help identify. Another option, which I didn't list here, is using your distribution reps or using your chemical manufacturer reps. So a lot of times I will get a picture from one of the distribution reps I work with. I'll look at it, I'll consult with folks on my end, and we'll get an answer to the end user to be able to help control that problem. And that goes for not only weeds, but diseases and insects as well. So we have resources such as extension or utilizing people in the profession. And then there are some weed literature opportunities that you can use as well. So this is a great resource from Purdue. I have one of these books as well as the electronic version, which just allows me to search. So I highly recommend this and purchasing it and using it as a resource as well. So again, we want to make sure that we're identifying correctly so that we can select the correct herbicide and not have to go back multiple times and kind of cure that problem, right? So we've got the right herbicide. Now we need to use it. And this is in particular with pre-emergence applications. We want to make sure that we're making those timely applications. And I guess with post-emergence, it does too. The larger the plants get, the harder they're going to be to control. But if we talk about pre-emergence in particular, we want to use all of our resources to be able to dial in that window. And again, as I had mentioned, I know that's challenging from a lawn care perspective, but Historical data, if you have information on the property or keep notes on the property, when you have seen weeds pop up here and there, we want to use weather predictors. So there's a lot of weather tracking or weather modeling that allows for alerts like, hey, it's time for POA to germinate in Texas, or we think in the next couple of weeks POA is going to germinate. So utilizing all of those resources so that we can better time those applications. And then this part is hard from a lawn care, right? Kind of situation is to scout for pests. You're not on that property every day, so that can be kind of challenging. I'm sure homeowners call and, hey, I'm seeing this or I'm seeing that. So utilize that information to kind of figure out when timing has to occur. And again, obviously, we're going to treat preventatively so that that active ingredient is in the soil prior to any weeds germinating. So we don't have a situation like this, right? So we don't want to have breakthrough because this is going to rely on now a secondary post-emergence application to clean up this area where we had germination. Same consideration too, depending upon what you're managing. Want to make sure that we're timing those applications. This was an application that was made on dormant or what was thought to be dormant Bermuda grass. It wasn't dormant. It was just kind of in that in-between stage. There is some growth there coming back. Bermuda grass is a beast of a plant, but again, those thin areas are going to lead to potential more weeds in those properties, more time and money spent for y'all to come back and remedy that. Not only do we want to talk about timing from getting the product in place before those weeds germinate or using post-emergence before the plants get too big, we want to time the application so that we don't have non-target issues in turf grass areas. So this is an example. I don't know what the herbicide was used, something non-selective. The tree wells were ringed, and whether there was too much product used, an irrigation event that happened, or a rainfall event, you can see that that product moved. It killed whatever turf grass was below it in that drainage pattern. And so now those areas are going to have to be reseeded, renovated, and then monitored closely for any weed encroachment, or even during the reestablishment period, any sort of disease that might come in. So again, time, money, man hours spent on fixing those areas when we could have just maybe not used as much product and time it so that we're not applying product when there's heavy rainfall that's forecasted. Again, challenging from a timing perspective when you're trying to get a number of applications in. But again, if we're looking at weather and we see that this kind of weather pattern is in the forecast, we do not want to make any type of application, regardless if it's fertilizer or pesticide. One, that's going to have the potential to move into storm drains, into the water source, but also that's going to be a waste of money, right? Time and money spent on application, as well as time and money spent on products. And a lot of the products that y'all use are not cheap. So again, kind of looking at weather apps and making sure that we're timing this right from a rain standpoint and not just losing that product that being washed away. And then wind is another issue that we need to be aware of from an application standpoint. Now, this picture was taken at a research facility at a university. They were using glyphosate to kill off a plot. The application was made when it was windy, right up to the edge of an additional plot, and you can see that glyphosate, the wind took it. Now, in this situation, not a big deal. We have a lot of, in Texas, where there's weed control, in certain cases, we have a lot of vineyards. So we need to be aware of circumstances where applications aren't made when that wind can take the product to, let's say, a vineyard and damage grapes that are very sensitive. Regardless of the whatever crop it is, if you're maintaining a home property and they have ornamentals, just be aware of what ornamentals are there, what herbicides you're using, and the potential impact of a non-target application due to wind or drift, something like this, right? So we don't want to have situations where you've left Mrs. Smith's house and she calls a few days later and you have offsite movement of that because of wind, and now you've got shrubs that need to be replaced or trees that need to be replaced. So timing application so that we're not losing any efficacy of the product due to it being washed away, but also being aware of if you're using a liquid application, the wind and taking that. Same thing with granular applications. I mean, that can move depending upon how windy it is, right? So just being aware of those weather conditions. And then we also want to talk about what we can do from a rate standpoint, right? So not only do we have to pick the right chemistry, we need to apply during optimal weather conditions, if at all possible, which I know that that's not always the case. And then what are we going to use for a rate? So the label is the law. We need to follow the label. This is an example where the label was not followed. The herbicide, well, I don't know. I can't say that. Maybe there was a miscalculation of the herbicide rate. It was applied at 5 times the labeled rate. And you can see that the DEC came in for this. There were fines. Potentially someone lost their license. So we want to avoid this at all costs. And the converse of that, the opposite of that, would be making applications at a low rate. So we want to be right in that optimal range that's on the label, because not only, and I have low rate here, but too high of a rate can also, above labeled rate, can cause resistance as well. So the way herbicide resistance can happen is if we're not supplying a lethal dose of whatever pesticide it is, right? So it might just be dinging the plant, but not killing it. That plant is going to develop resistance, and then it's going to multiply, and we're going to see more and more resistance over the years, more and more resistant populations, until the point where we can no longer use that chemistry because it's not effective at all, right? So some considerations with pesticide rate, follow the label. There's a range of rates depending upon what you're trying to target. In particular for weeds, use the recommended label rate. Do not use a sublethal dose, use a lethal dose so that we're not predisposing that plant to resistance. And then we want to make sure that we're rotating our chemistries, right? Rotating the active ingredients that we're using so that we can keep those chemistries as part of our best management program and utilize them as a tool for years to come. And again, following the label is crucial. Now, when we have the pesticide rate, we want to make sure that if you're mixing, that there's mixing compatibility, right? So this is a consideration. You want to do some testing. I don't know how crucial this is. If a lot of guys are using granular, not as crucial, right? But if you're mixing chemistries from a liquid application, making sure that those are compatible and you're not going to get issues which could lead to a failed tank mix. And then ultimately, if you try to spray that, clogged nozzles, all that good stuff. So prior to mixing, make sure they're compatible. And then one thing a lot of people don't keep in mind is if you're using a liquid application, the pH of the spray solution. So ideal pH is between 6 and 7. A lot of labels, herbicide labels, but also fungicide and insecticide will give a recommended pH period or range, but usually you want to get to neutral. Anything below that, or in particular, a lot of times alkaline pHs, those are going to cause the pesticide or the herbicide specifically to be less effective on controlling weeds in comparison to if you were at that neutral pH. In addition, what this table shows is product half-life, and this is just an example. We didn't give any specific examples here, but let's say you've got a high pH around 8, for example, which is very likely here in the state of Texas and in other areas where you may not have great water that you're spraying with. That is going to reduce the half-life. It can potentially by minutes, an hour. And so if you think about it, if you're using a liquid product, you mix up and then you go from one property to another, the efficacy of that product has the potential to be reduced. So I recommend getting litmus paper that you would test pool water. There's other types of kits that are available to test water pH, especially if you're filling up at a homeowner's house and then making an application. That's going to be crucial. So testing the pH, making sure those compounds are compatible if you're mixing, using the right rate. And then when we get to the point where we're going to make that application, we want to clean the equipment prior to doing that. So a lot of cases, if you're making an application or switching properties depending upon sensitivity, we want to make sure that the application or the application equipment is clean so that we don't have misapplication of product, which then could lead to turfgrass death or thinning areas, and then more weed problems or more pest problems in general. So we're going to clean the equipment, whether it's a spray equipment or if we're using a drop rotary spreader, we want to make sure that we're getting all of that granular out of there, especially if it gets wet. That can potentially affect the rate that you're applying at, and you could get too much or too little. And then lastly, we want to calibrate, right? So this is key, and there's a number of different resources for calibrating. If you're still using the push spreaders, or depending upon how you're making those applications, want to make sure that we're applying correctly so we don't get a situation here where you have over application. Checking the equipment to make sure that if you're spraying, all nozzles are working. If you're spreading a granular, that all of the vents are open and set to the right setting so that we're not over applying. And again, that's going to help minimize any potential for having situations like where you have turfgrass death in the picture before, or you have situations like that where maybe fertilizer was shooting out one side of the spreader more than the other, and you've got overgrowth in those areas. So again, we're optimizing our selection of herbicides, we're optimizing how we apply them, and then that, again, rotating chemistries is going to allow those compounds to be utilized in our best management program for long term and throughout the future so that we don't lose them as a tool. So all in all, we want to make sure that we're optimizing plant health and growth through cultural practices, best management practices, and then we're using those practices in tandem with pesticides so that we can maximize the efficacy of control and continue to use those throughout years to be able to have a dense, high quality, nice colored lawn that's going to lead to reduced callbacks and potentially increased revenue from obtaining more customers when they see what a great job that y'all do. So to finish this up, some resources, and again, I mentioned these already. Use your university extension offices. They're going to be able to give you the latest herbicide updates or pesticide updates if there are new chemistries out there, new ways to think about using them. Use your distribution representatives to be able to pick their brain about what they're seeing in the field, again, from a weed diagnostic, disease diagnostic perspective, herbicide selection. We love talking, well, I can speak for myself, I love talking to customers, and that's the same with chemical manufacturers, whether it's Envu, Syngenta, BASF, anybody that you work with, utilize them as a tool to help you in what you do in your business to be the most successful. As I mentioned, this is my contact information, so feel free to email me. That's my cell phone number. Please feel free to call me. I take calls on the weekends. If there's an emergency, please feel free to text me, call me. And it was a pleasure today to have the opportunity to speak with y'all. And I look forward to the opportunity again sometime soon. Thank you.